We might as well dive in and talk a little bit about that article as a preview, or that book as a preview. I didn't have my book, but I have notes. So my book is, I think, at my office. So the general, if he's had a chance to read it, he's fresher on this than I am. And I just have notes for the whole book, not that chapter. But the context is this. Milton was considered by first wave feminists an absolute evil sexist. And they hated him, and they kind of interpreted his life in horrible ways. For example, his daughter, I think I mentioned this in my lecture on his biography, one of his daughters hated his guts, his teenage daughter. And so at one point heard about about him marrying his third wife. And she said, well, I don't care about that, but if you told me he dropped dead, that would be awesome. So they say that he was sexist toward his daughters. They say that that he made them read passages of Latin to him without teaching them Latin. And so on. Well, I don't know his life story. He may have tried to teach her Latin, and she may have said, screw you, old man. And I happen to know from experience that teenage daughters go through a rebellious phase. So they wanted to interpret everything that he did as horrible and evil and sexist. And they said his Eve is the traditional temptress slut, and she is evil, and she is weak and simpering, and they said all these things. Then came the second generation feminists. I would say led by Diane Kelsey Macaulay. And her point was this: hey, first generation feminists, why don't you read the text? What the text actually says, ladies. And she makes a great argument, I think an enduring argument. Another one of that generation was Barbara Lewalski, who I met at the Milton Conference. Another one was Stella Rivard, who I hung out with a lot at the Milton Conference. And her husband and I became pals. He's an Okie. Carter. Anyway, that generation, that second generation, they're like, I'll tell you what, Milton isn't anti-feminist. He's actually pro-feminist. And they would put Milton's Eve in the context of previous views of Eve and the radical ways Milton empowers Eve. For example, Eve never tempts Adam. She's always portrayed, by the anti-feminists sort of writers of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance as a Delilah, as a strumpet, as someone. Well, Milton goes out of his way to say, she just said, here's the fruit, try some. Well, that's not on Eve, right? And as C.S. Lewis points out, if either of them are to blame, it's him, not her. Now, later we're going to read an article, or if we can find it, if that is to say, if Robert can find it, on Eve and the Doctrine of Responsibility so who's at fault for the fall? That's the next one. I believe that's Barbara Lewalski. I have that article here somewhere, but I wouldn't know how to get it to you. But another example of Eve's unmitigated power is Satan comes up, stares at her eyes, and she is so powerful and so good that it freezes Satan in his evil. That for the time being, her goodness overwhelms him and he is bleached of evil. And only because his heart continually generates evil does he eventually snap out of it. But I think it's Diane Kelsey Macaulay points out, it never says that about God the Father or God the Son. There's something powerful about her femininity, something inherently good about her femininity. Because of all those figures, she's the only one who's feminine. She talks about how that Eve is in subordination to Adam, but is not inferior to him. And if you think subordination is inferiority, then you have to say God the Son is inferior to God the Father. Because God the Son is elevated by being in subordination to the Father. Elevated morally. And in the same way, Eve is under the authority of Adam, but is not lesser than Adam, she says. It is true that she's tempted to narcissism by looking at the pool, but it's a good temptation because she learns to separate truth from illusion. Her pursuit of her own image is illusory, but her pursuit of Adam, or her acceptance of Adam, is real. So compared to every other view of Eve prior to Milton, she argues that Milton empowers Eve, that he's revolutionary in being pro-feminist. So that in general is her book. Now, Robert, did you get a chance to read her article beforehand? I'm sorry, you're muted again, sir.
I read part of it. I'm excited to finish it because I really think she's onto something.
Well, let's chat about it next week. Let's include that as part of our discussion for next week. Also, as part of that, we can talk about, if anyone can find it, even the Doctrine of Responsibility. I believe that's by Barbara Lewalski.
It's by Rivard.
By Rivard. Okay, good. You got that one too.
And
yeah, by
see
Rivard. I get those confused because I met them at the same time, the same day. And of course, Stella Rivard was the one that wrote that brilliant book on the War in Heaven. So she's doing double duty. I said duty. That's naughty. I always do that in elder council. Every time they say the word, no matter how serious, when someone says duty, I say, he said duty. Yeah, that's why I'm on sabbatical. Okay, well, let's talk more about that later. I just want to give you a context of what that second generation of feminists, I just love them. I mean, now I don't know enough about feminism to know what the third wave looked like. And really all of my scholarship, my current scholarship, except for the things I've published since, ended about the year 2000. In other words, I'm 20 years behind the curve. I wouldn't be if I were at OU or some other place, but we just don't have the ability to keep up at UCO with the courses we teach. I bet there's some brilliant feminists since. I just don't know. I don't know them. But I don't know what the third wave would look like. But the second wave, Milton was born again as a feminist. Hallelujah. Let's talk a little bit about books 7 and 8. What are some things in 7 and 8 that you found interesting or of merit or had questions about? Let's start in 7. I mean, at the surface level, 7 is really just about the creation of the universe. But there are some other interesting things going on there. So what are some things in book 7 that you looked at and you wrote, what the poop? Or of course, at the beginning of 7, we have one of our 4 invocations, and they're important. We'll look at those later as a group. I mentioned in my lecture that the very first word, descend, means we're in the second half of the book of Paradise Lost. We're descending to the fall in book 9, right? Like the plane going, right? Well, let me just ask this general question. What are Adam and Eve struggling with in their spiritual lives in book 7 and 8? Really, book 8. What are they struggling with? In other words,
His origin story.
Yes, both of them have origin stories, and we need to talk about those. Okay, so both of them are trying to think through who they are based upon how they started, right? That's great. That's good insight. Let's make that a category and come back to it. What are some other things they're trying to work through? Sex, definitely. At least Adam. Adam is so overwhelmed by sex, he's confused whether that's his God or not, whether that's his highest priority. And he's a newlywed. I mean, I get it. They just discovered sex. Of course, they just discovered life. And within 10 minutes of discovering life, they discovered sex, right? Right to the old Boweroony, right? So he's overwhelmed by that. Talk about that exchange between him and Raphael when he's sort of putting her up on a sex pedestal, how awesome she is. What does Raphael say? Do you remember? This is in book 8, starting on line 540. Adam basically says, I admit I'm an authority over her. I admit she tends to approach life through passion and I approach it through reason. Yet, she's so hot that when I get to looking at her, I think whatever she's doing is good and I want that too. Right? And I love this next line. Line 561. To whom the angel with contracted brow. What the heaven, Adam? What? Right? What the heaven's wrong with you?
There's more to life.
Yeah. Remember God? I mean, he's right. And what if she's, I don't know, what if she's smoking crack? What if she's eating an apple? Is that hot? And you're going to do it too? You know, she your God? Don't worship her. Get up off your knees. So in order to fall, Adam and Eve have to have potential weaknesses. And they can overcome those weaknesses or they can succumb to them. Sufficient to have stood or free to fall, says Milton. Well, one of his potential weaknesses is his obsession with Eve. And Eve's potential weakness is her obsession with Eve. Right? With her narcissism. Good. So those are some things they're struggling with. What else? What other things? Even Adam talk a lot about scientific things in book 3. And Adam and Raphael talk a lot about scientific things in book 8. What's going on there? Why the science? What's the...
It is interesting to me to go back in history and find things at their beginnings. I mean, the exciting thing about Homer, about the Iliad and the Odyssey, is when literacy begins, going from spoken to written. And same thing with Beowulf.
Yes, exactly. In that moment, that the first snapshot of an oral tradition into print, boom. Yes, good job, General.
And here you have that photograph of going from Earth-centric to heliocentric cosmology. I really liked, Adam is confronted with the vastness of the universe.
Good. And
I remember thinking some years ago, we tend to think the world revolves around us, and with Einstein, there is a certain truth to that, because my consciousness is right here, and everything revolves around me. Relativity, that is not an inaccurate statement. But on the other hand, we are on a very minuscule planet, and we're very minuscule on that. So why is the universe so big? And the thought I had was, when you have a picture, it's not complete until you have a frame. And you want the frame to match the picture to whatever. And if the world is about us, then it would be a frame that fit us. But if it's about the creator, it needs to be big enough to match the creation.
Oh, very nice. Very well said. Well done.
And isn't it that Eve really wants to get to heaven? I mean, she's had this dream that Satan has given her about getting to heaven, and Raphael has said, hey, you will become like spirit someday, and you'll make it there someday, and God expects you to make it there someday. So it makes sense that not only does she want to know like their origin story, but how do they get there? What's the difference between their world and...
Yeah, that you bring up a great point, Martha Grace, is Raphael is having to dance. He's having to make things up. He knows that Adam and Eve are going to fall. And yet he can in no way reveal that piece of information, even accidentally. Because if he does, it will preclude them to fall, because they'll know they're gonna. So on the topic of what's going to happen to them long term, he has no idea. God hasn't told him what would happen if they didn't fall, what would happen to them long term. And B, he knows there isn't long term for them. They've got a week maybe, right? But in his speculation, notice that Raphael comes up with the theory of evolution, which isn't supposed to happen until Darwin. He says, maybe over time you will evolve from physical bodies into spirits like us. And if you reach that point, you can come up to heaven, you can come up to hell, because what is earth but the shadow of heaven, which is the Platonic theory of ideas or forms. And earth is absolutely pure, heaven is absolutely pure. The only thing keeping them from going back and forth is physical bodies. So he says, what if you will evolve? Well, that's an awesome idea, but it's ultimately a dead end, because it's one he's inventing right now. And he knows it's not going to happen. The reader knows. The only one who don't is Adam and Eve. Also notice the radical concept in Book 8 where he says, what if, this is on line 140, book 8, 140. He says, Raphael says, what if that light sent from her through the wide transpicious air to the terrestrial moon, he's talking about the sun, beaming light, what if it be as a star? So he's saying, here's a crazy idea. We see the stars. What if the sun is just another star? Well, that's a crazy idea in those days. But he's right. And then here's the next curveball. I love this part. Be a star enlightening her by day as she by night, this earth. Reciprocal, if land be there, fields and inhabitants. So Milton, through Raphael, is recording the very first instance I know of someone speculating about ET, about extraterrestrials, people living on other parts of the universe. That's awesome. I was telling my wife last night that the great quest for ufologists from 1948 to about a year ago was to force the government to reveal that they'd had encounters with UFOs. That was the big deal. Well, COVID hit, and since then, the government has released several official encounters with the Air Force and UFOs and given the film footage. And then Sunday, American Airlines had an encounter with a UFO. And they released the audio recording. I just heard it today. So this era where everything has gone mad, people are going, oh yeah, there's UFO, who cares? I mean, this would have been sensational 5 years ago, but now it's just like, hey, would you get the Bigfoot out of the way? I'm trying to watch the UFO story on CNN. Everything just got crazy. But the fact that Milton is doing what I would call cutting edge science. Remember, Milton did nothing for a couple of years but study cutting edge science. Remember, he visited Galileo. Maybe you look through the telescope. So why would he incorporate all of this science into a discussion of the fall of humanity? I mean, why do you think it's important here?
I wonder if he's like, when it comes to science, there's this debate over what, like whether to discount it or not, if that makes sense. So I wonder if during the Enlightenment, because this was during the Enlightenment period, right?
Just barely, right?
Just barely, yeah. So maybe
it started in 1660, and his first edition was 16. So 7 years in is when he wrote this. An age too late. Good. Go ahead.
So maybe it was like a, not necessarily an attempt to like draw those enlightenment thinkers, but maybe to show that the like the universe or creation I don't know how to phrase this. I don't want to say goes hand in hand with science, because I don't feel like that's what I'm trying to say, but I mean, like there's explanations, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm sorry. I know where I'm going.
No, I do think that.
Like
I do think that there's some sense in which Milton, everything he writes, he wants to be comprehensive. He wants to deal with every possible issue, and he wants it to be true.
Yeah.
So he has done immense research in biblical commentaries, in the Greek and Hebrew language, and science.
It's almost, I
And-
feel like they go hand in hand. Sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think they do. I think as part of trying to say what's true, he isn't just a Tertullian guy. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does science have to do with theology? It's all true. And natural theology, there's a whole field of theology called natural theology. And what it is, it's the study of the creator in order to understand. You study the universe in order to understand the creator. And in the Enlightenment, it became the main form of theology because they became skeptical about, God working miracles or whatevsky. Robert, could you email me those also,
Well, if you insist.
please?
And
Both of those.
The phrase was, when science is thinking God's thoughts after him.
Yes, good. So, natural theology, glorifying God through the creation in Book 7, and glorifying God through our cutting edge understanding of the universe in Book 8, are all part of a field of theology, a subset of theology called natural theology. So, all of it is designed to justify the ways of God to men, right? Good. So let's go back. Any other ideas before we go back to the first category, which was, I believe, a discussion of their origins? What are some other things, other categories that we can talk about that are preoccupying Adam and Eve? Science, sex, their origins. Eve's potential weakness is her own narcissism. Adam's is his obsession with Eve. Okay, well, other topics. Let's just jump into their origin stories. How do they each come about?
Didn't Adam say, I'm trying to find it. I can't remember where it was, but didn't he say he like kind of just woke up in the garden and started walking around and wasn't quite sure who he was or why he was there? But he like,
Apparently he was created elsewhere.
Yeah, that's what
and
I
then
thought was interesting.
Placed in the garden.
Yeah. So then there's the question, like, where was he created? Was he created like a mountain and a cloud?
The Bible says the same thing.
Yeah.
That he's created elsewhere and then he's popped into the garden. My theory is Guthrie. He was created in Guthrie. Red clay, it's just a theory. It's a working theory. Yeah, so that's a weird fact. But again, Milton is strictly biblical. Go ahead. And didn't know where he was, who he was. Then what happened?
I'm trying to remember. Doesn't he start walking around, but he like knows what the animals are called.
He names
Oh,
them.
I think he names them.
So one thing that C.S. Lewis has pointed out is Adam was born a professor and born with amazing analytical insight. So he sees an animal, he understands the essence of that animal and names it immediately. And he names all the animals. And that is in the first few minutes, starting with the first few minutes of his first day. So that's awesome. Okay, good. What else?
Can I comment on that? About
Please.
names? Names are significant. I mean, in some societies, they're almost mystical, and you don't give someone your whole name. And in fact, was that the Ents in Lord of the Rings that says that you don't give your whole name?
It gives
Uh,
power to that person over you.
and we discover that even now, when we don't understand something, one of the first things to understand, to gain power over that, is vocabulary.
Good.
And you find something, you invent something. The first thing you do is give it a name, and it's part of showing your power over it and being able to wield it, to use it, to and so that was part of his being over creation, was that he was. Was it Lewis that said that giving them names was in essence not just giving them a name, but also assigning their role in creation?
Yeah.
You know,
That
you were a
he is
lion,
the
so you will
king
now do a
assigning
lionly
them
thing.
roles. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So
That's
it.
awesome.
Sorry.
I know a lady. I know several people who have undesignated illnesses that they're always in a quest to find what that illness is. They know all the symptoms, but they just want to know the name. And one lady I know says, okay, I'm never going to find out. I'm going to call it Bob. And, you know, she'll say, how are you doing? Well, Bob dropped by this morning, you know, and it kind of gives her power over it, because the others are still going, they're agitated because they want a scientific name that's in the books, you know? So that's an awesome point. So, okay, go ahead, Ashlyn. You were saying we are now on book 8, right about on line 350. He ends up naming the animals. And then we have this strange Socratic dialogue between him and God. And of course, I go into a great deal in my lecture about that Socratic. But what are some of the features of that discussion? What are some things that are said, and what do they mean?
Sorry, I need to reread it again.
After looking at all the animals, the first thing Adam says is, I'm alone.
And didn't like God intend him to not be alone? If that makes sense, like he sees all the pairs of the animals.
Good.
So there's obviously something that he's missing.
He realizes
by
there's
himself.
not an Adam ass.
Yeah.
There's a lion and a lioness. You know, there's not a female one of him. But he can't quite articulate that. He just senses his own loneliness. But notice that God makes him work for it through Socratic method. He goes, alone? What's the problem? I'm alone. Look at me. I'm completely alone. No problem. So
that bothered me, because I can see where Milton is accused of being a what is it, the heresy of, he's not being Trinitarian at this point.
well, keep in mind that we don't know that it's God the Father speaking to him. It's just God. So we don't know that he's being Arian here. The point is that God in his godhood doesn't need anything else. He doesn't need a Mrs. God. He's complete in and of himself, right? And Adam points that out. He goes, well, you're alone, but you're complete in and of yourself. I feel like I need another me, except softer and sweet smelling hair and bumpier, you know, in certain places, right? But why does Milton create this dialogue? Is it not in the Bible? Why doesn't he just say, well, what you need, Adam, is a woman? I can tell, right? Why does he do this I mean, it's a long passage where he has this Socratic dialogue. It goes for something like 200 lines back and forth. So why? It's not in the Bible, of course. Why does he go all Socratic at this point?
I wonder if he wants Adam to it's probably not the best way to phrase it. Maybe like recognize his own loneliness in a way. Like
Good.
he's
Why is that valuable?
well, I think it teaches him, like Adam himself, that he can't do it alone. Like he has to have like God. He has to have, not saying he has to have a woman. I'm not saying that like in general, you know, get married, whatever. But that you're not meant to live life alone.
Good.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And so he needs, and for the human race to survive, he needs Eve,
Mhm.
right? Because if he's alone, even if he lives forever, he's the human race. So he articulates his need for Eve, and that's valuable in and of itself. What else?
That is almost a little bit like evil. God is at each step of the creation each day. He says it is good, and this is the one point where he says this is not good, and that seems to be the essence of evil, is the absence of good. And so, in one sense, there's talk about cerebral knowledge versus experiential knowledge. This is a hint of experiential knowledge of evil, an absence of something that is needed, something that is good, something that makes it better.
Is it automatically true that which is good, that the only step down from that is evil? So God says it's not good for Adam to be alone, but God is the one who created Adam to be alone. He didn't create Eve at the same time as Adam, at least not in Genesis 2, right? Genesis 1, it kind of implies they were, but I guess that's the broad overview. So even Jesus in the Gospels grows in grace. So that doesn't mean he was evil. He just grows in goodness, right? So Adam needs to be more complete. Almost like the Christian notion of sanctification, right? To grow in that which is good so that we grow into more good. But the point still is that Adam's spiritual growth has to be in a team sport. He has to have Eve in order to grow in himself as well. And I don't know. When you're young, you're arrogant. You think you don't need anything. You think you don't need anybody. And Adam's pretty young in this conversation. He may not even be a day old yet. And yet he has the wisdom to say, I'm lonely. I need. So there's a humility there, I think, that's good. He is the emperor of the planet. So I think that's good. What else? What about Eve's origin? We never really got to talk about her origin. Wait, let's back up. What about the fact that she's created? He's anesthetized. He's in the post-op. He gets up, where's my bib? And he wanders around and he sees her, and she's a little confused. We'll get to her part of it. But then he says, you're my wife, I'm your husband. And they immediately go and they make crazy love. I mean, from the moment he met her, it may not literally be 5 minutes before they are in flagrante delicto, right? Any problems with that? Any discussion of that? Anybody want to grapple with that? Because certainly the Bible doesn't say that they immediately went to bed. Milton has them immediately going to bed.
Wasn't that not necessarily like uncommon at the time, like when you have arranged marriages and that sort of situation? So I'm not saying like that was always good or bad one way or the other, but in that sense, that's kind of what it reminds me of. Like, you both are like you're each other's spouse. Have at it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's kind of not the best way to phrase it, but
no. I mean, arranged marriage, you meet the person, you have the ceremony, that night you're in bed. I mean, the same day you meet, you're in bed in some cases, especially politically arranged marriages, like between kings and so on. So, okay, great point. And so our modern perception of a long dating relationship and so on, it would seem rushed and immoral to meet someone and have sex with them within a few minutes. That would seem unusual for a Christian handbook now, right? Oh, we lost Ashlyn.
Just visually.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I'm here. My husband just called me. Sorry.
Okay, that's great. That's
Sorry.
great. Sorry, my phone went off too.
It seems to me that he's exercising the beginnings of inductive and deductive reasoning, because he has seen all the different animals and he's seen the way of animals with each other.
Ah.
And he goes, let's see if our things work the same as their things.
Okay, I hadn't thought of that. That's a really good point. Maybe he saw the animals, sporting, playful.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Nice.
This might be, I guess I could take a somewhat feminist view, but
good.
She's been there a few minutes, and she's wandering around and she's confused and she's trying to figure out what's happening. And Adam swoops in and he tells her, "You're my wife. We go have sex because that's what you do as my wife." So I feel like her entrance into the world, she doesn't get a chance to figure out like who she is and what she does like Adam did.
Good.
And all of a sudden Adam's like, "Here's what you are." So I think even from the beginning, she's kind of set up to like not be given a voice of her own, maybe. Or
even to explore who she is at the pace that Adam was able to explore.
Not quite fair. That
is a great point, Martha Grace. That sounds like a paper or a part of a paper that she was given a prefab housing of an identity. Now, I do think it's interesting that, unlike other pieces of literature, she wasn't resistant to this. She apparently she is not a wilting wallflower. She gives as good as she gets in the bed, right? Milton later says, "Nor turned I ween Eve from her connubial right." So she wasn't just, sort of shutting her eyes and thinking of England or something, like Constance does in the Canterbury Tale, right? But the point is that she is not given a chance to arrive at that conclusion on her own. That's awesome, Martha Grace. I love that. Other ideas. Oh, let's go back to her. She wakes up, she wanders around. First of all, she looks at her body and goes, "Whoa, this thing's awesome," which is cool. And then she wanders around looking at things, and then she falls in love. She sees her image. Why does Milton do that? Obviously, Milton, as I said, in his right hand has the Bible, and in his left hand, Greco-Roman mythology, and he's always intermixing them. And the Renaissance theory at the time was that things happened for real, and over time, by telephone game, word of mouth, they became somewhat or extremely corrupted, and that is ancient myth. But then God told Moses what really happened, and it's not a telephone tag game where one here says to another over centuries with people throwing in lies. It's the unvarnished truth. But Milton is suggesting that contained within Greco-Roman myth is what he would call an Areopagitica, the scattered body of truth, that there's fragments of truth. And so sometimes he will make analogies in Paradise Lost between what's happening in this biblical epic and what happened with Greco-Roman myth. So obviously there was the myth of Narcissus, who falls in love with himself by the pool and becomes a flower bending over the pool, always staring at himself, right? It's a symbol of certain people we might know who are sort of psychologically narcissistic, as we call it. But why have this happen to Eve? That's not in the Bible, that she was particularly narcissistic or she looked in the pool. We don't know anything that happened to her prior to the fall, really. So why put that in there?
Could that be a nod to humanism in the Renaissance?
How so?
That before that, the proper subject of thought is God and his creation, but not ourselves. We're just worms. And here is, no, we're part of creation too. We're made in the image of God. We need to pay attention. Baby's fascination with their fingers is not bad.
Okay. But the text implies that her lingering long in love, staring at herself, isn't the best thing.
Of course
And
not.
having Adam show up snaps her out of it, and she realizes that, you can't kiss your own reflection. You can't make love to it. You can't develop a relationship with it, that it is ultimately solipsistic, right?
But that fits in with, God is a Trinity. God is a community. And to be made in his image, we are not fully in his image until we have the other. And
okay, but why do that with Eve? Why not have Adam look at himself in the pool? If you're going to do that to illustrate a kind of growth from selfness to other, why not have Adam look in the pool and then God say, Adam, look over here, dude. Why is it Eve? Or why not both of them? Why don't they both stare in a pool and then later look up and see each other?
Maybe you couldn't make it scan right.
Well, we have to assume that poets have the ability to get around the difficulties of their own scansion, right? And he doesn't have the problem of rhyme. So my point is, Milton is trying to tell us something about Eve. And I'm not sure what it is, other than she has her potential weakness is is narcissism. But if we go with the theory that Eve tends to more represent passion and Adam tends to more represent reason, notice that God manifests himself to Adam through sheer reason. Let's talk. Let's use Socratic method. And God and Eve gets oriented to her environment by passion, by falling in love with her own reflection, and then adjusting that passion to fall in love with Adam. Now, I don't know. I just came up with that just now. Never thought of it before. But I'm trying to answer a question. Why did Milton write the text this way? What does it mean? What does it teach us? We're almost out of time. Any other thing that you wanted to cover in book 8, 7, and 8? Notice that as a narrator, Raphael was given one thesis. God said, warn him of the apple. And every narrative strand, whether he's talking about Satan's revolt in book 5, or the war in heaven in book 6, whether he's talking about knowledge within bounds in book 7 and 8, whether he's talking about whatever it is, he always ends that segment with, and don't eat the apple. He says it directly. He says it indirectly. Keep knowledge within bounds. So as a narrator, Raphael is awesome. Notice how much of Paradise Lost is actually the narration of a different character. So for 4 books of Paradise Lost, we have Raphael. He's there, in book 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then books 11 and 12 are the narration of Michael. So as a sub-genre, storytelling and narration end up being a really huge part of Paradise Lost, half the books. Then we have Eve's narration of her creation, Adam's narration of his creation, and we find that, like the Bible, much of the truth of Paradise Lost is by formal genre storytelling. And I think that's interesting. I don't know what to do with it, but okay, are we all doing okay with our readings? Are we keeping up? More or less? Hey, we're almost done. We only have 2 more weeks.
Yeah.
So next time is the big one. It's book 9 and 10. We're going to have the fall, probably the 2 most important books of Paradise Lost. But not only think about the fall, think about the rise. Because Milton doesn't end it with book 9. He has Adam and Eve become the role models for all humanity in the way that they rise from their fall. And so look in little ways that they learn how to walk in dignity and grace as fallen creatures in a fallen world. And now we are to Milton's Puritanism, because that's what Puritanism is about. In a fallen world, walking in grace with God and with those around you.